This is the 50-year-old front bumper of my 1975 Camaro, and it's in pretty bad condition. It's scratched up, it's hazy, and not to mention, it's only connected to about half of a car. And while I know nothing about polishing aluminum, I've never been afraid to step up to a task. So in this video, I'm going to be polishing this bumper from this crusty old 50-year-old neglected state all the way up to what it looked like when it first came off the lot in 1975.
So the first step of restoring this bumper is going to be disassembling the entire thing, and that's going to start with taking this rubber piece off the front. And in order to do that, we have to take all of these little nuts off of the back that hold it in through these little studs. Now initially I thought this was going to be a very easy process, but I quickly found out something that's going to make this restoration a whole lot more difficult.
So it turns out that I think that there's actually bolts that hold this rubber piece that are inside the corners of this bumper, which are underneath this bracket. So I'm gonna actually have to take the whole aluminum part of the bumper off of the brace here just to get the rubber piece off. Yippee!
So I then began the grueling process of stripping all of these rusted parts off. Now these have been sitting for so long that they are basically welded together with rust, which made this entire process so much more difficult. I'm struggling with giant pry bars, hammers, air hammers, you name it. These parts were so difficult to take apart, I would not wish this on my worst enemy. But it is going to allow us to get a much better finish on this bumper, which is, again, the goal of this whole process. So after about an hour and a half of beating these pieces apart, I finally got it to start moving off the front end. And you can see here as I'm air hammering it, one side at a time is starting to slide out of its little holes there, and eventually we get the bumper completely off so we can access the rest of it.
After about 2 hours, we finally got the bumper off here. The springs are staying on the car and the bumper has been popped off. You can see how rusted these tubes were that go inside these bores, and that's what ended up taking so long to get this thing off. But we finally did it, which means we now have access to all of these brackets that are hiding extra bolts that hold that rubber piece on. So we should be able to pull those off, and then we'll be able to get that rubber piece off and finally start our process of polishing this thing.
So the next day, I headed back into the garage, and I managed to rope my fiance into what I promised would only be a half hour of work. That ended up turning into about 5. And the agenda today was just to get those brackets off so we could get access to the rubber piece and pull that off finally. But you'll see here shortly why everything ended up taking so much more work than we initially expected. So the big problem with this bumper, and I will leave it up to 2 words to describe it, is carriage bolts. Now, if you've not had to deal with rusty carriage bolts before, consider yourself very lucky, because the second that you start trying to take a rusted carriage bolt out, it just spins in place. And that's exactly what ended up happening to these 18 carriage bolts that hold the braces onto the front bumper. Do I know why they had to be carriage bolts? No. But were they a pain to get off? Yes, absolutely. So we had to use a combination of an induction heater, vice grips, various impact wrenches, and a whole bunch of other tools to get this off, but we did eventually get these brackets out from the inside and were able to peel that rubber piece off the front, resulting in a completely bare aluminum bumper. So now that I knew how to tear apart one of the bumpers on the Camaro, I figured, let's go ahead and do the rear bumper while we're at it. And this one came with a whole nother list of problems to deal with. Now, having learned my lesson from the first bumper, I started by hosing everything down with penetrating oil and immediately going straight for the air hammer off the bat. We're not wasting any time on this one. Now, just like the front bumper, everything on the rear one was rusted together, so it made pulling everything off a huge pain in the butt, but at least I knew kind of what to expect on this one. The biggest problem is on the front bumper, the 2 cylinders that fit together and were rusted did not come apart at all on this one. So I had to get really creative on how to pull these leaf springs off without pulling the two pieces apart, which was not easy, but we were able to do it. Thankfully, most of the bolts on the rear bumper were fairly accessible, and the ones that weren't really accessible, we were able to finagle a normal box wrench in on, which helped pull these pieces off without having to take the rusted bits apart. So in the end, these pieces actually came off a lot quicker because we didn't have to take them apart completely. With all the brackets off, all we had left to do was pry the rubber piece off the rear bumper here, and we were all done stripping this one as well. Overall, I think the rear bumper went a little bit easier than the front bumper, majorly because I already knew what I was doing, so that always helps a little bit. Now that we've got both the front and the rear bumper stripped down, it's time to clean up all of the brackets that were holding everything together. Now these rusted metal brackets have definitely seen better days, and we're gonna do our best here to wire wheel them to get all this rust and crust and nastiness off of them, so when we put them back together, it will stop corroding the metal, and these will be able to live for many, many more years. Following a 3-step process to get these cleaned up, I start with my bench grinder with a wire wheel on it, then I move to my hand grinder with a wire wheel on it, and then I move to a more detailed wire wheel brush that I have on an impact driver that helps me get into all of the detailed areas. This process is fairly lengthy, but it does get them really, really clean, gets pretty much all of the rust and the grime off of these, so I've used this all along for every part that I've needed to clean up on this car so far, and it's worked really, really well. Now in total, I have 10 different brackets that I need to do this to, so I won't bore you guys with running through every single one of them, but here are a couple before and afters to see the results. Now, while I was cleaning up the brackets and the leaf springs that go on the rear bumper, I realized that one of these leaf springs has a huge crack all the way through it. It's completely busted. And while I don't think that it would actually make a huge difference to reinstall it broken, I'm just not about that. So I know that I've got to fix this in order to be happy putting it back on the car. But before doing any welding, I want to properly prep the surface, and that means grinding through a little bit of extra metal on this to make sure we have a good, solid penetration when we do make this weld. Since I'm not stick welding with some big, powerful machine, I want to make sure I can get the best chance of penetration on this that I can possibly get. So after grinding down a little bit more metal here, everything looks good, and we can start clamping everything and getting our initial tack welds put down on the spring. So with the welds completed and the springs strong again, it's time to grind these flat. Now functionally, I don't think this really makes a difference to grind them down, but I want them to be smooth and look as nice as possible when we paint them and put these back in the car. So you don't have to do this, but I prefer to make them look pretty. Now after I got done welding, I took a closer look at the rear bumper and noticed these two giant chunks taken out of the back. So unfortunately, this is going to require some aluminum welding to get fixed. So I'm going to load the bumper into the back of the car and take this thing up to my friends at DRZA Auto to have them do some aluminum welding on this and maybe even teach me some things along the way. Now this guy in the green here is Derek, and Derek is an absolute expert when it comes to all things automotive. And when I brought my bumper up to him, he said, sure, of course I can help you get this thing welded in. But little did I know, he was actually going to be the one putting me to work today.
Here, go ahead, knock it down.
Oh, me?
Yeah,
I'm going?
Not? You want to do it or you want me to do it? Here,
So
let's
we're
go.
doing-
Yeah, we're going that way.
All right.
We're going to clean from like here to here.
All right.
So first off, Derek put me to work grinding down all of the oxidation off this bumper using a brass wire wheel. Now this takes all the rust and crust off of it really well, and I'll definitely have to remember this when we work on the front bumper. Then Derek took over and knocked down a little more of this metal using this little sanding tool, which I definitely need to get one of these because they worked super well for this fine detail sanding. Then he started using a slightly finer sandpaper to get rid of a lot of this oxidation around the general area and also expose more of that fresh aluminum so it would be healthier to weld on. Then Derek used some isopropyl alcohol to clean all of the tiny grooves that are left in this bumper after sanding. And all throughout this process, he really stressed to me how important it was to keep the metal clean when we were doing welding.
The cleaning part is the hardest and the most technical aspect of it.
Okay, that welding is easy, cleaning is hard. From the expert.
Yeah.
Then Derek preheated the metal with a blowtorch to get all of the moisture out of it, and you can see all of the moisture leaving as he heats this metal up, which was really cool to see. And finally, after all of that prep work, we were finally able to start welding this. What I thought was surely only going to be maybe a 5 or 10 minute job turned into almost 2 hours of work to get this thing properly repaired. And it took that long mainly because we kept distracting Derek while he was trying to do his job, but also because he's super meticulous and wanted this to turn out as best as it possibly could. After the welds were built up and cooled down, it was finally time to start grinding these back into the shape of the original bumper. Now this was a multi-part step with many different types of sandpaper and different techniques and tools that were required to get this as perfect as possible, but what first looked like a crash-damaged, crusted-up bumper very quickly turned into something much more beautiful.
So we're all finished up here at DRZA Auto. This guy is the Nissan man, so obviously he is doing work for us on our classic American muscle, but this came out absolutely phenomenally. Thank you so much, Derek. I appreciate your work on it, man. This has come out way better than I expected it, and I got a free lesson on how to do aluminum welding, so I can come up here and just use his equipment whenever I want.
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. All right, awesome. Thank you, Derek. Let's get back to the car. Now we have a bunch of new hardware that's going to be going in the front bumper to replace the crusty old stuff that we pulled out. Unfortunately, when we pulled these carriage bolts out, a lot of them just spun in place and ended up creating rounded holes where there should be square holes. And the only way to fix those rounded out holes is to upgrade the bolt size for the carriage bolts. So we have one that's just a little bit bigger here that we're going to be putting into all of these holes. Now the only way to square out the rounded hole is to take a metal file like this one here and file down the sides of that rounded hole until we get a large enough hole that can fit this bigger square carriage bolt in it. So on just this bumper alone, I have 18 different bolts that I need to re-square up to the larger bolt size before we can even think about getting the rest of this thing cleaned up and polished, because I don't want to polish it and then have to file down a bunch of edges to fit these larger bolts in it. Now before we get started with squaring up and fixing all these holes, I want to give a big shout out to BoltDepot for sending me a ton of new hardware, not only for the bumpers, but for the Camaro as a whole. Now I actually originally bought all of the hardware for the bumpers through BoltDepot because they were the best source that I could find online to get the bolts that I needed, and they ended up reaching out and saying, hey, can we send you a bunch more stuff for your car build? We love what you're doing. And I said, absolutely, I don't mind at all. I love free stuff. So later on in this video, before we get these bumpers done, I'll show you all of the cool stuff that they sent me. But while we're focusing just on this bumper right here, they've sent out the carriage bolts, they sent out a bunch of other hardware for this. So thank you so much to BoltDepot for jumping on board this rebuild and helping me get some new hardware for the Camaro. Now with that being said, let's get some new holes filed out.
Now, shockingly, it was actually a whole lot easier to file these holes out than I expected. Yes, it took a little bit, and yes, it took some physical labor, but grinding through solid aluminum is so much easier than grinding through steel. So thankfully, this bumper is solid aluminum, which made the process a lot simpler for me, and all it takes is a little tweaking here and there as you grind the sides down so you don't make it too big, and sure enough, those bolts eventually fit right in. And after only about an hour or so, we got every single one of these holes properly filed down, and our carriage bolts are seated in every single one of them. These new bolts from BoltDepot are looking really good in here. Next up, it's time to clean the oxidation, dirt, and gunk off the front of this bumper, where that rubber piece was starting to erode away and make this thing look really bad. We're using a brass wire wheel that won't cut into the aluminum nearly as much as a steel wire wheel, and after only a little bit of light wire wheeling, this bumper is completely transformed already with all of that gross rust coming off. Next, we need to get the inside of that rubber piece treated for rust and sealed in. So we're putting some rust converting chemicals on it, drying everything off, and then we're going to put a nice light coat of primer and paint on the back here to seal everything in and hopefully protect it for much, much longer. Next, it's time to bring the front of this rubber piece back to life. I'm taking 1000 grit sandpaper and lightly sanding down the entire front face of this. This is going to help give us a nice smooth surface and give us a little bit of extra bite on our paint when we put it down. Now, you can't just use a normal primer and paint on this. No, you need something that is going to be flexible. This is rubber after all. So I'm actually using a marine grade black paint that comes in an aerosol container that I'll be able to just spray on like a normal spray paint and get this thing a beautiful glossy black finish, again, like it would have been in 1975.
So now that our bumpers are completely filled and ready to start polishing, we can start the sanding process. Now we're gonna go through a whole bunch of layers of sandpaper, getting this thing fully smoothed down and ready to start machine polishing. I'm gonna be wet sanding the entire thing from 120 to 180 to 320 to 400 to 600 to 800 to 1000 and then all the way up to 1500 grit sandpaper. Once we're done sanding, we'll break out the machine polisher and our polishing compounds and get this thing looking like a mirror finish the way that it always should. So I've got my bucket of water down here, and I've got my cup of water here to keep me hydrated out in the Florida sun today, because it is a hot day and I'm gonna be out here for a couple of hours just sanding this down to be ready to polish. So let's hop over to the time lapse and get this done. Actually, we can't start polishing yet because it turns out that the entire bumper is coated in some sort of clear coat. I don't know if this came from the factory on the Camaros or if it's something that the previous owners did, but this stuff is super hard and it is taking a ton of time to sand off. So before I can even get to sanding the metal, I have to get all the clear coat off. So it turns out that the coating isn't actually a clear coat. It's from the anodization process on the aluminum, which creates a super hard, durable shell around the aluminum. But we can't really polish that, so our only choice is to strip the anodized aluminum off and get back to the fresh aluminum so we can polish this. Now finally at this point I was able to start the sanding process, going from the low grits all the way up to 1500 grit, wet sanding by hand on the entire top face of this bumper. Now I'm just starting with the top face of it first and then we'll move to the front face later, but I just want to see the complete polished result on this top face so I know if what I'm doing is correct. So we've got the bumper almost completely polished up and it's time for one last stage, which is a total wipe down with a white diamond polishing pad. This is for finishing off the final product and sealing in all of this gorgeous shine. These white diamond detailing pads make it super easy for me to finish up the polishing process on here, and I can even use them to maintain the polish in the future.
So now that it's all wiped on, we just gotta let it dry, and then we wipe it off with a microfiber, and this thing should look gorgeous. Now, personally, I think this is pretty dang good for a first-time job, if I do say so myself. I'm super excited with how this came out, and now, unfortunately, I just have to do 2 more faces of this bumper, and then the entire rear bumper. So, while this does look awesome, I've got a ton of work left before these can go back on the car. So now that I know that my process is pretty sound and I have some experience with this metal polishing thing, it's time to get the rest of the bumper cleaned up and polished. Thankfully, I knew what I was doing this time, so it didn't take quite as long, but this whole process still took me about 3 hours to get this fully polished. Now with the front bumper all polished up and looking beautiful, it's time to get these inner brackets painted finally. Now we're just going to coat these in a single layer of Rust-Oleum black paint just to encapsulate all that rust and make sure that we don't get any nastiness coming back in the future. Hopefully this will keep it encased forever and we'll never have to deal with painting or dealing with these brackets again. So now that we've got all the bumper pieces polished and painted and ready to go, it's time to start reassembling the front bumper. We're going to start by putting the rubber piece back on, then all of the interior brackets, and then ideally it should just bolt up right back to the front of the car with no problems. But as usual, that's probably easier said than done. So reassembly actually went fairly easily. You put the carriage bolts in, then you put the rubber bumper on the front, and then it was time for us to start putting those interior brackets in. But I did run into a little issue along the way. So I've run into a couple geometry problems while trying to get these inner brackets hooked back up to the bumper. The new carriage bolts that we put in are about twice as long as the old ones, which means that when I go to put these brackets in, I can get one half in, and then the other half doesn't want to go down. So in order to get these to fit, I have to bore these holes out a little bit bigger and also make them oval shaped, and then we have enough flexibility to get this bracket put back in properly. And fingers crossed that when we put it back up to the front of the car, everything is still pretty lined up to the point where we'll at least be able to get it to clearance in and fit properly. But for now, I have to modify every single one of these brackets in order to fit the bumper again, so this is going to take me a lot of work. Now that we've got all the brackets hooked into the bumper, it's time to attach it back to the front of the car. But unfortunately, while I've been working on this project, I must have lost track of these bolts that I had here that I used to initially pull the bumper off the car. Now, these are really gross and really rusty, and normally you guys would see me run off to the store and go grab new hardware, but thanks to our newest sponsor of the channel, BoltDepot, we've got a huge box of bolts back on the wall there that I can just go and pick one out of. Now to figure out what bolt we need, we're just going to use our handy bolt checker here and check the sizes. It's not 5/8, it's not 1/2, and it looks like it's a 7/16. Then we come over to the thread sizer to check what thread we have. Is this 13? No. 14? Yes. We have a perfect fit. So this is a 7/16 14 bolt. And even with the rust, we know that these nuts go on the end of these, so that's also a 7/16 14 nut.
So let's run over to the bolt cabinet here. We've got 7/16 14 by 1 inch, 1.5 inch, 2 inch, 2.5 inch, and even 3 inch long 7/16 14 bolts. And these are 1 inch bolts, so we know exactly what to grab. And that's how easy it is to replace your old hardware when you work with BoltDepot. Now, as I previously said, BoltDepot is sponsoring the channel, so I'm a little bit biased here, but to be totally transparent with you guys, I did actually purchase products from them well before they started sponsoring me. I love this company, I love their products, I love the quality, and if you guys want a bolt organizer like the one on the wall behind me, let me tell you what, it is absolutely worth it. I spent over $200 in gas last year running to and from the store just to get hardware. So factor that in when you buy one of these things. It is worth every single penny. But now that we got our new hardware, let's go ahead and throw this bumper on the front of the car and see how it looks.
Now, reinstalling the bumper I thought was going to be probably the easiest process of this whole thing, but those leaf springs wanted to fight me pretty much every step of the way to get back in their proper seating holes, and I ended up using longer bolts than what I needed to slowly draw the leaf springs into the holes that they needed to be in, and then slowly downsizing the long bolts to shorter and shorter and shorter bolts until I was able to get the entire thing properly seated, tightened up, and hooked back to the front of the car. So now, let's see how this thing looks. So with the front bumper completed, it's finally time to start cleaning up this rear bumper. We're going to take this thing through the exact same process that the front bumper went to, but unfortunately, we won't be able to mount it in this video because I have a lot of metal work to do on the back of this car, and the bumper will just cover up things that we need to tear off anyway. Now, one thing that's going to make this process a little bit different from the front bumper is that we need to do some rubber repair on this. So we're going to start with this rubber putty that you can actually mold into the shape of the missing piece on this bumper, and then hit it with a heat gun to cure it in that shape. Once it's cured, we shave down the sides to kind of get it in the right size to fit in the bumper. And then I realized that just by shaping it to the bumper didn't mean it actually stuck to the bumper, so now I realized that I need something to adhere this piece to the bumper itself. So it was an easy solution to get this to cure back to the bumper. We broke out our old buddy YesWelder to get this solidly attached. Now, I'm almost 100% certain that there is some sort of specialty product or something that is at least better than YesWelder to do this, but honestly, for something that is sandable and will get this to adhere really, really well, YesWelder is about the best thing I had around at the time, and I think this will do perfectly for what we're needing it to. Now, that being said, I quickly realized that trying to sand down rubber to make it flush with another piece of rubber is nearly impossible, so I'm actually going to cut into the rubber and bring it down below the edges of the rubber bumper and fill all of the crevices with additional YesWelder to hopefully get a smooth transition between all three pieces. This, in theory, once it's painted, should look completely seamless. So while that YesWelder is curing, we're going to go ahead and polish up the rear bumper to get it nice and beautiful. And this one, I think, turned out even better than the front bumper. Just look at that beautiful shine that it's got on here. Nothing makes me happier than seeing shiny stuff.
So both bumpers are finally completely polished to a mirror finish. And as per usual, it took me till the final piece of the rear bumper here to figure out how to get maximum clarity out of my sanding work. On both bumpers up until the final piece, I was just sanding left to right on the whole bumper, thinking, well, it looks like it's knocking everything down and everything looks pretty mirror finished to me, but when I got really, really close to them, you could still see left to right sanding scratches. And obviously, we don't want those in our final mirror polish. So I'll chalk this up to an issue of not having enough experience, but sanding in a crosshatch pattern the same way that we would on bodywork on the car gave us a much, much better mirror finish on this thing. And I mean, it is unbelievably crisp how good the reflection is.
Now that being said, this whole process has taken me almost 50 man-hours to get to this point. So if you do this on a daily basis, this is your full-time job, is polishing aluminum, hats off to you, my friends. This is something that I never want to have to do again. But I quickly want to talk about why I decided to polish the bumpers instead of just getting them re-anodized. I spoke with a couple local shops about how much something like this would cost, including stripping the rust off the parts, replacing all the hardware, reassembling everything, and re-anodizing the bumpers back to factory spec. And I was quoted for 2 bumpers, a $4,000 price tag. Now, all in with all of the tools, all of the hardware, all of the polishing supplies, I got out of this with under $150. So, in my opinion, is saving $4,000 worth it for me to spend 50 hours doing something like this? Yeah, that's kind of the point of a project car. This isn't going for perfect restoration quality. This is something for me to learn on and see if I can figure out how to polish aluminum. And frankly, I think I did a decent job, but I'm always open to learning more. So if you have tips or tricks on how to make this process easier or less time consuming at the very least, please leave me a comment down below. I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. Now at this point, the final piece of the puzzle is getting the rubber piece back on the rear bumper. And I'm not going to be able to put the rear bumper on because the rear of the car has so much rust still that needs to be repaired that I don't feel comfortable putting this thing back on. So I'm gonna get that rubber piece finished up, painted, and bolted back to the rear bumper, and that will be the completion of our bumper restorations. Also, real quick, if you made it this far into the video, we're looking at almost 29, maybe 30 minutes of runtime at this point. So thank you so much for watching this far. It really helps. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you've watched this far, I highly recommend it because I do have other videos other than this one. And if you manage to watch through 30 minutes of me yammering on about restoring bumpers, then you might find some of the other stuff that I've done pretty cool too. Well, after over a month of work, both bumpers are finally done. The back bumper and the front bumper are polished up, the rubber is fully restored back to a nice beautiful black shine, and I think they look absolutely awesome. Now, while this is one of the first major cosmetic upgrades I've done on the car, I've still got a ton of work left of getting the body on this thing looking good again. And because the bumpers are now restored, I've basically run out of things to postpone doing body work on this thing. So I'll be starting from the back so we can get the rear bumper reattached and then moving all the way forward up to the front of the car, doing the side panels, the fenders, everything along the way to patch in all of the rust holes and get this thing looking good again. So that being said, if you guys enjoyed this video, please go ahead and subscribe, like the video, leave me a comment telling me what you thought. I have a ton of work left on this car, so make sure and join me along the way as I get this thing back to its former glory, and I will see you guys in the next one. See ya.